I'm going to start off today kind of doing what I would consider a pretty quick overview of what OAC is. And the first part I want to cover is largely architectures. One of the things that I can truly advocate for in this process is more or less how easy it is to provision some of these instances. Now, I am going to talk about OAC with regards to the autonomous release. And for those that don't know much about OAC in general, the biggest thing to know, or the biggest difference, I should say, to kind of clarify between the two, is that the autonomous version is a version of what we historically have known as, BICS or S-based cloud. It's a more scripted version of those releases. And by scripted, I mean that the actual services and all the things that make up a stack for S-based or OBI or both of those products are more or less done all behind the scenes for you. In previous releases, and if you speak to customers about this, you might get the same response. There was more of a setup involved. And so for a lot of customers, the headache of managing a database server in the cloud and a container service in the cloud and all those other sort of things was almost a bit cumbersome, almost to the point of, what it might have been on premise. So what I'm going to do actually to start off with is just to talk a little bit about the screen that hopefully everyone can see right now. The screen you're all looking at is what I would consider to be an admin screen, so a screen for somebody that can manage an OAC instance. So if I click on this, I'm just going to kind of show you more or less what's behind this, and can really show you how much we don't have control over certain aspects of this environment. So in other releases of this product, you might see things like patch the environment, or different details about user permissions and things like that. Because this is autonomous, the way that Oracle more or less sees this environment is pretty much this simple. They see a release version, which, as you can tell, is, again, it kind of correlates to what you see with the database, 18, C, etc. You can see what edition of the software, which I'll cover in a minute, the number of OCPUs allocated to this instance, and kind of some of the other details around licensing. And one of the other things I'm going to talk a little bit about is IDCS, which is the identity aspect to this. So you can see that this is actually set as a ready, meaning it's available, people can access it, it's active. And again, this instance is live. If I wanted to see certain, performance metrics around that, if I click the little heart icon here, depending upon how long this takes. Perfect. Well, certain aspects of this, again, may or may not work in certain browsers. I've experienced myself, just Safari being a Mac user, some of these screens don't come up, more specifically the user's screen. Sometimes I get errors with that, but I've seen that, IE, Firefox, and Chrome tend to work a little better than those. But I do want to go back out and just show you, again, this is kind of our summary of the environment. And I also want to show you the process of creating an instance. But the other part of the process that's already been done for us is that we've got, again, behind the scenes, we've got our account already set up. Oracle more or less, again, activates an account. You make that available, you get emails, etc. You get set that up. The next part is really, again, almost as simple as this. You basically pick the application type that you want to build, and you click a create instance. In this example, again, I already mentioned I have the OAC, kind of called the OBI equivalent, that we've got already deployed. But now if I want to deploy an S-based environment, I've got to do that actually separately. So if I call this one, OAAC S-based, okay, I can kind of, again, give it its own name, a description as well. This is the email that would, or the email account that any notifications would be sent to. That means if it fails, if it starts, if it's patched, etc. The region is defining kind of what data center you want us to put it in. I'm doing this in the vein of kind of, again, building an S-based component to the stack. Again, the confusing part for a lot of us is when you hear OAC and S-based, they're, again, sort of, it's almost implied that the two exist in the same place. Down here at the bottom, you'll notice that you have 3 different selections. Oracle advertises OAC as Enterprise, Data Lake, and Standard. And the 2 types that you'll see that actually include S-based are Data Lake and Enterprise. I'm going to talk more about the Data Lake edition later, but let's assume that we use Enterprise. On the right is actually where we choose the S-based component itself. So at this point, I've basically created a name for this instance, chosen, again, if I wanted to, a region where I want that to exist. I can add tags to it. That becomes really helpful if you have tons of, Oracle Cloud components. And then the number of OCPUs I want to allocate. I'm just going to keep it as 1 for now, and then just go to the next tab. And this is essentially everything, again, very high level about your environment. At this point, you could also download the configuration selections. This is sometimes helpful if you're kind of doing a trial of this, and then you say, okay, I want to take the trial to another, kind of full production instance. You can kind of take all the different steps you've done here. There's only 2, so it's not, too difficult. But in previous releases, again, you had 2 or 3 different pages you'd have to go through. But now I'm just going to click Create. And again, this kind of takes, I don't know, I'll call it 30 minutes or so. I already have an Essbase instance up, so I'll be able to show you parts of that. But that process now, again, is going to basically run and create all the database entries it needs, all the container components it needs, and it actually creates the URL for us. So literally, by the time this is done, I'll get an email, and it might even be during the session, and I'll be able to instantly log in. So that's the process, again, as simple as it looks and sounds, to again, more or less create an instance and make it available in your kind of domain. I'm going to move ahead, and again, I hate to sort of treat this like a baking show or something, but we're going to wait for this thing to finish, and then of course, when it's all done, hopefully by the end of the session, we'll actually see a new Essbase environment available. But I'm going to cut over to what I was talking about before, which is the kind of core OBI element within OAC. So I'm going to click on the little kind of drop down over here on the right. You're going to notice I've got 3 options. The third one being delete, which is, as it sounds, you can delete the entire instance in one go if you want to. If you wanted to add additional tags to it, maybe you want to call it like OAC demo, or maybe it's a certain type of demo, you can tag it that way. I'm going to click on the analytics URL, and that's going to take me into the environment immediately. Now, I know one of the questions that tends to come up around security and things like that is, well, how do I log in, and what's that process look like? I'm not going to go into great detail about how that works, because it is a lengthy process for some types of security setups. So if you're using LDAP or SSO or a combination of things, there are separate screens for that. The one thing that I can say is Oracle kind of set it up kind of nicely so that if you're logged into Essbase and you're building something on one of your cubes or updating something and planning, the idea is that if you then wanted to go into OAC or another screen, that single sign-on more or less is in place. So you don't have to re-log in every time. Now, I've done a couple of things in this environment ahead of time for this demo. Again, just to kind of walk through some steps of how and why we might do certain things here. But for those of you that have used OAC or used even data visualization before, a lot of this stuff is going to look familiar. I do want to talk more about initially here, kind of let's call it the foundation of what OAC really is, and some terminology. So one of the very first things to understand is that while a lot of us have experience in things like Essbase or multidimensional data sources, and others have data warehouses or really any data source that you can kind of connect to and build queries on, one of the core things to remember is that OAC and really analytics in this space thinks of everything as a data set. And the reason that's important is when we think about building reports, and a report could be a combination of some data from my billing cube and some data from Salesforce.com. We have to think of the join between those different data sets as joins, but they have to reside almost like we think of joins in a database today. So a join between different fields at different levels and all that sort of stuff. One thing that isn't immediately obvious is how you would do that, and I think the long-term kind of game plan for this product is to put more emphasis on how to manage the data and data sets that you've got. In the interim, or really the short term, what you're seeing here on the home page is that we have the ability to kind of check out all the data sets I've got available to me, download some sample stuff, connect to new data sets. And again, all that stuff is basically happening right here on the home page or the landing page. To understand more about what connections exist and all that sort of stuff, I'm going to go to the top left-hand corner here, and I'm just going to click on the data tab. And the data tab is a very, if you think about it from an admin perspective, it's kind of where you go to make, again, all of your data connections. So, where you enter your credentials, to connect to things like your Essbase server, your data warehouse. And then on the data sets tab, you can see here that the data set is represented in a number of different ways. At the very top here, I have a play-by-play data set for the NFL 2018 season. It's a CSV file. I've got spreadsheets, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and a cube that actually relates to those spreadsheets, and then just an ASO cube that I brought in. So all of those, again, are viewed as data sets. They're not viewed as anything other than that. Traditionally in Oracle BI, if you've used it before, you're probably used to hearing the term subject area. That term is still used, but in this part of the tool, and I believe kind of Oracle's vision with this product is to think less and less about subject areas in the way we traditionally have, and to think of your data sets first. Because again, a lot of our proof of concepts or even full-blown projects depend not necessarily on a full enterprise data warehouse or star schema model, but sometimes it's just a combination of 3 or 4 spreadsheets. So that's kind of the first thing I'd say. The next tab over here, which is connections, is going to show you all the connections to any system that you've got. Now, there's a couple things that are, being critical of kind of what Oracle's done that I'm not a huge fan of. One of the things I don't think is very obvious here is that if you are a customer who owns PBCS or one of the Fusion Cloud products, it's not immediately obvious that you can create a connection to those sources. Now, I've already created one for the S-Base server that I've got, but I want to create a new one, let's say. And I can do that by going to the top right-hand corner and choosing Create. Again, for those that have used data visualization or OBI 12c, you're probably used to seeing parts of this. One of the differences, though, that you're going to see on the bottom is this data replication and replication connection stuff. So again, where it is kind of confusing is that if I were to go create a connection right now, I can see a long list of different data sources. So for those, again, that have used things like Tableau, Power BI, really, any system out there today that has an ODBC or JDBC driver to data sources, you can see that those connections are still available. You could, in theory, build a connection using that same screen I just showed you. But with the Autonomous Analytics release that just came out, we actually have a dedicated connector for that type of source. So if I click on that, I get a list of all the different platforms out there that I can connect to. Then this is, of course, just a preliminary list. I'm sure this will grow as time goes on. But again, you can see that those items are listed here. And if I click on any one of them, like the Talent Acquisition Cloud, I can provide all the different, kind of connection details as you'd expect. Now, what's interesting about that, once you get your connection created, you then can go build your data replication process out. And I can click cancel, and of course, I don't have a connection at this point. But what happens on this page is actually you can connect, again, to your source. And so this almost resembles like a Golden Gate type of process where you can literally replicate the data from your source system or systems into a target connection. The target connection, as far as I'm aware, is limited to the Autonomous Data Warehouse in the cloud, the database as a cloud service, or I think any native or local Oracle database connections. So it is fairly limited in the short term, but you would again connect to that in the schema. I'm going to go back though, and it's going to take me back to the connections page. I do want to show you a connection though to S-Base that I set up so that you can kind of see some of the features that are there. So if you're used to seeing any of the older versions of this product, you're probably used to seeing some of the connection details, normal type of stuff. But some of the other things that have changed is that you can actually take the permissions and pass them to the user. So if you've got things like data filters or something like a shared services setup, and you want to, again, make sure the data is filtered as a user is querying a cube or an application, you obviously can set up a connection initially to pull the cubes in as yourself, but you can also choose the bottom option here, which is just to use their credentials or have them enter it every single time. So that's a kind of newer setting that has more recently come out. And then down here at the bottom is you can start assigning who actually has access to that specific cube. So aside from the data level permissions, you can restrict or permit access to that. And the reason it's set up as both the connection having permissions and also the cube is because the connection will allow them to add additional cubes in as data sets. Of course, if you don't have more than one cube, it doesn't make a difference. But if you have 10, 20 applications available in your S-Base server, and you only want 3 or 4 of them to be available to a certain set of users, you could go here to the connections and set a separate connection for them. I'm going to go back to data sets though and open up one of the cubes that we're going to be looking at, and that is the sample basic initially. So if I click on the little drop-down menu over here, what you're going to see is that I get, again, kind of a list of options. One of them is open to a new tab, inspect, reload data, duplicate, etc. I'm going to click on inspect and talk a little bit about what this actually means. The inspection tab is something that usually just shows like things like permissions or how a specific data set might be set up. But in this example, what's changed in I guess I should say the most recent release of OAC is that you can now certify data sets. The reason that certification is important is because OAC has a process that runs called the BI crawl, or the BI crawl search engine, I guess. And by certifying this data set, I'm allowing the system and other users in the system to be able to search for data within this application. And it doesn't have to be a cube. It could be a spreadsheet. It could be a database table. But search for that data and the columns and the names and all the sort of stuff that exists within that data set. But it has to be certified. Again, the reason for that is, imagine if you're building out a pretty big OAC environment, you're getting your hands on some data. You might not want, kind of your dummy data sets or trial data sets to be considered certified, since they're not, maybe necessarily production, ready or anything like that. So by certifying it, it allows me to go down. I'm going to search and index the data set. So indexing the data set more or less means that you can take the data set, or in this case, the cube, and actually, allow people to search for the different names. And this kind of would be the equivalent of searching for the generation of the level names. But you can also search for things like values. You can also put it on a schedule, which again, if you say, I want it to basically refresh every day, that means that it basically does like a sort of preview query against the data set. And then it caches that data so that, again, when you go to search, you're able to search for actual data within the cube itself. So if I click on save there, it basically saves that. And again, you can tell now that again, the modified time, oops, go back, sorry. Oops, sorry, let me go back to the home page. There we go. So it looks like it was modified. Now the data set itself wasn't actually modified. So you see here that the refresh time is still back as 11:45. If I click on reload data, it goes back into the outline, and if there are any changes to the outline, it will obviously refresh that. I'm going to start off again by looking at this sample basic application here. So I'm going to build a report in OAC is as simple as just clicking on a data set. You could go to the top right-hand corner here and choose new project. I'm just going to click directly on the sample basic cube here. And it's going to open up, for those that haven't seen this before, we again would just refer to this as DV or data visualization. The desktop version that you download today, and again, there are different versions of the desktop tool. The desktop version that you can download off Oracle's website today, and I believe the release is as of September, if I'm not mistaken, is not compatible for the on-premise version of OBI. Just so if anybody finds himself downloading it, just make sure you know that the most recent version only works with the OAC cloud version of DV. And that's, again, something Oracle hasn't really put out there, but it is important to note. And part of that is the way that, again, the tool is working with some of these data sets. So in previous releases, when you connected to an S-based application, you were limited in terms of the types of things that you could do, depending upon if it was ASO, if it was BSO, or how the measure dimension was actually stored, how many members existed there. In the most recent release, you can see that it flattens, and by flatten, I mean it creates a measure column for every distinct measure member. So in this example, again, if I were to go to the outline, I would see possibly a structure here that resembled, again, more of a hierarchy. And you can see in the way that it's naturally imported that cube, everything is kind of flattened out into one kind of standard, if you think about it as a star schema, kind of fact table, which they're just calling basic. So to begin the process of building a report against this, and one of the things I did want to talk about today is report building against this sort of typical database table versus a cube, is if I go and I'm just going to add transactions in here. All right, so no data is immediately retrieved. Now, for those of you that are, again, used to building reports or have worked with Essbase for some time, you know that the key with most of your queries has to do with the intersection. So, you know, what data resides, you know, in the middle of these dimensions that I've got. So I've got on the left-hand side here, obviously, geography. One of the other things that's important to note is, and this is, again, something that Oracle hasn't really gone into a lot of detail about, is, you know, for those of you that aren't used to building you know, your generations or levels with specific names in mind, if you're going to be reporting on it in OAC, I would consider, again, going back and trying to rename some of those levels so that they're more reflective of what they actually mean. For time is a good example. If you've got year, quarter, month, etc., a lot of times it'll just come in as, you know, period repeated over and over, just like you're seeing here with geography. So I can see here, you know, Gen 2 geography is here. If I want to drag that over, okay, I get no data. Now, this is, again, part of just what I would call sort of one of the challenges or immediate challenges you get when you're reporting against the cube. If you've been traditionally used to building things like Oracle database-driven reports or things like that, you know, this process might seem a little foreign. You'd expect to get some result back in OBI or even in DV. But again, because we're working with a cube, we might have to pull in other elements. So I'm going to pull in a YTD column. All right, still no data. Now, again, I will also kind of reemphasize that, you know, because this is a cube and because there's certain aspects of this that might, you know, seem obvious over others, one of the challenges, again, that you tend to run into is if you're not familiar with the actual outline, you may be used to seeing things as YTD, or you might just be used to seeing year. This is what I would consider to be a bug, but currently there is no way to search for the metadata. So even if you had a member or a level that was named year or period or something like that, it isn't immediately visible or searchable. So you have to be able to drill into each of the folders here. One of the other things you can always check out too is, you know, this is a graph, obviously, and sometimes when we're looking at data sets coming from a cube, it might, again, not be immediately obvious as to how you want to sort of visualize that. The easiest way, in my opinion, is to always start off with a pivot table or something like that, because you can more immediately see the data and not necessarily worry about, you know, the graphical side of it. So I'm going to add in products now. All right, still not getting anything back. Let's try a couple other ones and see what happens. All right. So again, just want to clarify the kind of reaction, or really the sort of output that we're seeing here. We know that obviously there's probably data in the cube. We know that there's, you know, a good chance that, you know, this tool is just not understanding how to query it correctly. And this is something I've personally run into a number of times with Essbase. So in this example, if I click on the store manager again, it's doing a query to go get all those distinct members back. But again, I'm not able to see anything here in the middle. If I take the measure out, however, I can actually see that I get null records. So at least there was a relationship behind the scenes. It's just not able to get that particular attribute, or in this case, measure back. If I drag units in, again, I still get no data. So part of the challenge here, of course, is just understanding, again, the kind of dimensional structures that you've got in that source. Again, if you already know how to report against this, it might not be a big deal. But again, one of the challenges we often see is that when you're used to building something in SmartView, where you can essentially just double click and drill into the hierarchies as you'd expect, that behavior is not going to happen here. You've got to basically know where you're going, you know, and have all those columns in place before you start. So let's assume that this data, or this might be an ASO cube. All the definitions are there in terms of the members of all the different dimensions we've got, but maybe there's just no data loaded. So let me go open a cube that, or an application that does have data. Now I'm going to cut back over to the Essbase part of the tool. I'm going to go back to DV in a minute, but I want to go back to Essbase just to show that aspect of it. Now, I'm not, again, think of it as a cooking show or something like that. I haven't actually finished baking the pie, but I'll show you what the baked pie looks like. So I'm going to open up an outline for a cube that I've already built. I'm going to actually go back to the home page really quickly. So this is the quote unquote new homepage for Essbase Cloud. And again, you could just refer to it as Essbase Analytics Cloud or OAC. To me, it's still sort of Essbase Cloud. But you can see here that every single application that I've got available in this server is listed out. And of course, if I drill in, I can see more details about it. I am going to talk a little bit about some of the Essbase parts. One of the interesting things as a developer, and this I tend to run into this again when I'm looking at on the analytics side, how to consume data more easily, is that you do actually have a pretty interesting feature now, which is the analyze feature. So for billings, let's say I'm going to build a report now on my billing data, but I don't want to run into the same problem I just ran into in DV. So let me go ahead and check out or analyze that data set. If I click on that, it takes me into a new tab. And the rumor on the street is that this is Oracle's kind of approach to handling some of the smart view customers out there that are not necessarily trying to focus too much about, on staying in Excel, I guess, or prototyping, if you will, online, and then maybe doing something with it after the fact. But it looks and feels a lot like, for many of you, probably what you're used to seeing. So, if I'm, interested in kind of what's happening within each quarter there, or I want to pivot, right? You can kind of get an idea about, again, what data does or doesn't exist. Depending upon, of course, your level of access with the application, it might be a really nice thing to just kind of go in and check out some of the data, do your keep onlys, do your refreshes, so if you're making changes to the outline and you real time kind of want to get an idea about, what's changing or what's happening, again, you can kind of do all that stuff here. You can also issue MDX directly. I haven't tried this yet for anything overly complex. But again, if you've got some MDX that you already want to issue just to sort of see how, how that would look, you could use that here as well. Again, that to me is a pretty impressive, I guess, new feature for this release, because historically, again, I would go to DV and just try the queries out there, but it seems more kind of practical, especially if you're used to using things like SmartView. So the next thing I'm going to go into, again, I built a little cube called Billings, and I'll just show you, again, some different details about that really quickly. So before I go build a report, again, kind of talking through the life cycle, if I'm an Essbase developer, I'm obviously going to be building out my outline first, understanding where the data sources are coming from, et cetera. And so in this example, with Billings, clicking on Inspect, again, which historically, that's a pretty common word in OAC, is going to show us all the details about permissions, et cetera. This actually shows us a lot more about the cube than I would say DV does. So again, if you need to find out more information about all the distinct levels, et cetera, you're better off kind of going to this page than you are, of course, going back into DV and trying to find it there. Now, one of the things I mentioned before is you can see here that, again, all the generations, all the levels are labeled as you'd expect, kind of generically as you're building out your outline. So as an example, if we go to build a report now and I've only got, one level to supplier, no big deal. But if I've got, year, quarter, month, et cetera, at this level, I might want to actually change the names. So if I go, and I'm going to show you an example of how to refresh this later, but if I got to change this, again, one of the things you'll want to do on the BI side, of course, is refresh your data set. But I'll show you that example in a little bit. In the meantime, you can see here that there's a number of files that obviously make this up. You can upload files, so even if it's a file that you're not necessarily using, to load the cube now, it's still treated almost like SharePoint or something, where you can upload files that are the actual data all the way over to the different XML or property files that make up the cube. You can see here that you've got all your calc scripts, drill through, rules, all that sort of stuff displayed, and even add, if you have them, additional filters. If you've seen this part of the tool before, or you've seen versions of this, it hasn't changed substantially. The UI has from the previous release, but in terms of the things you can do, they're all pretty much the same. I am going to go into the outline now just to show you again what that looks like. So if I click now and go to outline, so this is again the newer version of the outline display. I think Brian had mentioned before that this looks similar to another version or release of the product. I'm not as familiar with like PBCS and ePBCS and stuff like that. So if you've seen this before and you're aware of different ways that this has been displayed, this might be really boring, but I hope that some of the stuff is fairly interesting. So we talked about supplier before and some of the things you can search. So again, if I didn't know that Conoco, as an example, was in here, you can search for that distinct member. And of course, once you find or click on anything on the left-hand side here, the properties show up here on the right. If you're not used to using a lot of the middleware products, or you haven't historically used systems like this, they unlock property here in the top right-hand corner is, of course, going to allow us to unlock that particular outline. And if I click edit, it allows me to, basically now I'm opening up a live version of this outline, so I can make modifications to it. There is also, of course, the Excel-based version of the Cube Designer. I'm not a huge fan of it, but I know it has its strengths over using the browser. There are certainly things between the two tools that I would say, the online version is better at, and of course, in other cases, things like searching, etc., the spreadsheets or the Cube Designer in Excel seems to be a little bit better. But for the most part, this works for a lot of the smaller applications. You can also go and add, additional siblings or children. You can cut and move things if you need to, and you can kind of highlight multiple records here and move those around as well. On the right-hand side, of course, if you want to change consolidation or the storage type or anything like that, you can do that over here. And you can see here for our measures, I can kind of get an idea about, again, how my measures are going to be displayed. Now, again, just to reiterate, in this cube example, I'm expecting to see basically all three of these measures, even though total charges is made up of all these underlying metrics here. I expect to see every single one of these measures in DV. Now, my experiences so far is any member that's treated as label only tends to not show up. I don't know if that's changed in the last couple of releases, but historically things that are, kind of label only or not really used, rather just display, they don't tend to show up. But I believe anything that is dynamic or stored data type or storage type will show up directly in DV. I do want to show you, of course, how this cube looks in DV. So we'll go back over to, here we are. So back to our OAC environment. And I'm going to click on, again, my billing cube here. Just immediately click on it and takes us back into this DV screen. All right. Now, at the very top, kind of like what we saw before, if I had to, again, draw sort of a correlation between the two, billings, of course, is just the name of the application, the cube. I don't know why the naming convention is that way, but basically it just takes the name of the cube and then it basically creates that as the folder for all of your metrics. So in this instance here, I've got all the different columns as I would expect, including my total charges, which, like we said, is sort of a combination of different metrics. And I'm going to, again, very simply build a report out. Now, if you're used to seeing sort of financial reports or more, tabular in nature reports, you can actually go to the left-hand side and pick a specific visualization type and use that, as opposed to clicking and dragging your columns over and then trying to change it. Just a heads up, Oracle, obviously, with this tool, and of course the name kind of gives it away, it's a data visualization tool. It's intended to, out of the box, take things like, so if I take actual, estimate, and rail, and the supplier, and just simply drag all that stuff over, the first thing it does is it creates a scatter chart. Again, just to reiterate, guys, for some people, it might be right on for what they're looking for. But again, historically for SPSS applications, especially those that are financial, this may not be practical whatsoever. So your first step might actually, you might be better off, I should say, by going here on the left-hand side and just choosing a pivot. And then what that allows you to do is you can say, okay, well, I'm going to go take my estimate, rail, et cetera, move those to values, then add my supplier in. Okay. Now, the process of building a report obviously is I hope, for most of us pretty straightforward in terms of looking at, the data and understanding kind of the structures that we've got here. The other thing I oftentimes sort of struggle with is it's always really easy to do a demo against a data set like this because it's very small, right? It's not a huge application with years and years of data. In a lot of situations, because DV is a very ad hoc and very kind of like almost like click view, like very click and go, it's easy to forget that filters are important. But in a lot of situations, again, my first recommendation, aside from choosing the visual you want, is to actually create a filter. Now you're going to notice on the left-hand side, again, we got all your columns here. You can even see that it's identified our month and what looks to possibly be like a year as time elements. But if I click on that and drag it up here to the top and choose Q1 as an example, I can see it's already filtered the data for me. Now, if you add Q1 as a filter ahead of adding or building out any of your pivot tables or tables, it should reduce the query substantially the first run. DV, of course, does not try to pull the entire database back, but it can, again, depending upon the type of query you're running. This visualization, again, is pretty straightforward, pretty easy. Some of the other things that I think are kind of nice, about this release is, again, you can very easily just duplicate a visualization. So, I've got this by supplier over here, but let's say I want to change that by origin. So on the right-hand side here, just to simply replace supplier with origin, I just drag it on top. And I've got two separate reports, obviously with the same metric data, but of course, one's related to supplier, one's related to the origin. If I said, oh, you know what, actually would love to have an origin filter, again, a couple ways you can do that. I can go here to the left-hand side and just simply right-click on that and say create filter. It's immediately going to add it as a filter at the top, doesn't move the column here. I can also say, you know what, within this report, I actually want to see a specific month, but I don't want to change the filter here at the top. So you can actually go into, in this case, again, Gen 3 month, and drag it down to where it says filters here. And now you get a visualization level filter. So I can say, actually, I just want the month of February within that result set. What's also nice about this is once you get the report, so if you're giving this report to somebody and they say, hey, I want to see why this report looks a little bit different, these numbers don't make sense if I'm looking at the data over here, it immediately adds here the sort of filter value, and you can click on that and even change the filter directly from the report. So it's very, very dynamic, and I think, again, Oracle's done a lot of work to try to make it very easy to see why your data might be presented a certain way. But of course, again, that's very much an aesthetics thing for a lot of people in terms of how they want to see it or visualize it. Some of the other things that I've run into, just my feedback or experiences with the tool, especially when working with Essbase, if you have a measure dimension that has, I think the limit is 100 members or something. So if you have 150 or 200 members, the current release actually creates only a single measure column. I don't have an example of it because I don't have a data set that big, but it creates a single measure column. And one of the challenges you run into is right now, actual volume, as an example, is a number, but the rail here is actually a charge, so it's a dollar amount. On the bottom left-hand corner, you're going to notice that all of the, again, more aesthetic, but still important. If I go over to, again, forming here, I can display that as currency. The reason I say this is because it might seem really obvious and easy, no problem, but when you're only working with a single measure and you're using the hierarchy or what we would sort of see here as a standard dimension column, and it's just listing off all of your measures, you almost have to think of every single metric this way as a case statement. Just something to be kind of aware of is that you have control or more control over the aesthetics when every single measure member is actually broken out into its own column than you would if you had hundreds of members and you were sort of forced into, kind of creating case statements for each one. So that's the other thing I'd say that is kind of, the other thing I wanted to, of course, show you is changes. So what happens when I make a change in, Essbase and how does that then reflect here? So I'm going to go ahead and save this project. I'm going to go back into Essbase here, and I want to go change one of those levels because, again, from an aesthetics perspective, I don't want someone calling me and saying, hey, what does, I think I've only got one level for, yeah. So in, I don't know, let's call it month here. What is month gen and what is Gen 3 month, right? How do I more immediately know what that is. So if I go to, again, our inspect tab here, what I'm going to do is actually go change the generation names. So it's kind of goofy how it works. I, again, don't know why they did it this way, but we'll work with it. So I can call that quarter. And again, if you kind of click away, it'll work, and you can click save. Oh, what is it not like? It's also not as cooperative sometimes as you want it to be. All right, well, I thought it was going to work for me today. I'll give it a go another time. But again, if you were to make a change here, I guess what I wanted to show you is on the DV side, if you ever run into a situation where you're kind of working with a live in development cube, on the right-hand side, you're going to see this little kind of drop down. And what you'd actually do is you'd select first refresh data set and then refresh data. I've run into a couple instances as I've worked between the DV and Essbase side of the tools that if you just refresh the data, you still run into errors because certain members, or in this case, a unique description isn't found. And so you'll get kind of funky errors out of OAC. But usually those two things, once you do those, it will refresh on the left-hand side and should also update your reports as well. I'm going to go over to narrate, and this is one of the last things, of course, I'll cover, but this is also something I think is really, I call it a nice add from Oracle. They've certainly done some work here to make these types of reports a little bit more appealing to things like, people like executives. Let me look over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag what we call our canvas over here down to what appears to be sort of like a PowerPoint presentation. So in the bottom, down here at the kind of bottom ribbon area, you can see that it's kind of if I had multiple canvases, it could be a listing of different canvases. And the reason it's set up this way is it's actually designed to be more of like an interactive PowerPoint slide. I say that because, again, if you're thinking about, building out like a income statement or something like that, you probably wouldn't have, all these visualizations. You might only have a subset. But if you had, sort of like a board review or something like that, and there were 10 or 20 different visualizations you wanted to look at through that process, you could add them all down here in the bottom. Now, what I did is just added a single view over here, but you can on the left-hand side see that you can hide certain pages, you can display a title, you can add a description. So you've said, okay, let's talk about this as our Q1 initiatives. Okay, and you can again almost treat it like a PowerPoint presentation. You can also on the left-hand side, do things like auto fit, choose which visualizations you want to show in the canvases you've got. You can make sure that filters show up or don't show up. And then this is another really important or kind of interesting thing that you can also add. If I'm an executive and I go, well, what's going on with Chevron this quarter? If I click add note here, and this isn't the same thing, of course, as like inline commentary or cell commentary that you see in something like a smart view, but you can add it immediately to the visualization. In some ways, of course, cell-based commentary is a little bit more effective on a specific cell. What's nice about this, of course, you can kind of provide a more summary view. So I can say what's going on with this supplier. And now once I've created that, I can just move it around. I don't have to see it all the time. I can edit it, I can duplicate it, I can delete it all together. Now, when I think about this as a presentation, though, and I go to presentation mode, it shows up as you would sort of expect, right there in the middle of the page. On the top right-hand corner, you can choose to just hide them by clicking that button. But again, by kind of enabling it, you can start to see that Oracle's also, at the same time they're looking at extending visualizations, they're also trying to incorporate things like social, commentary and feedback. If you've downloaded or looked at the day-by-day application as an example, which is the iPhone or iPad app, you can actually see them making more of a push to do, really interactive, referencing other users in the system. So really interactive commentary and things like that.